Conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds. Good afternoon, all. My name is Stan Fudge, community activist, 35 years at the Riverside Fire Department, and I just want to introduce some of the people on the show today: Jeremy Murray, Michael German, Matt Patino, Mary Texera, and our technology is Thin Lee. We're going to do start with the land management.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Patino. I am an adjunct history instructor at Crafton Hills College. I'm also a former police officer with the Rialto Police Department. We recognize that the campuses of California State University San Bernardino each sit on unceded indigenous and ancestral homelands. For San Bernardino, the land of the Gabrielino peoples, Chemehuevi peoples, Serrano peoples, and the federally recognized land of the Yuhaviatam of San Manuel Nation. For Palm Desert, the land of the Cahuilla peoples, and the federally recognized land of the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians. We recognize that every member of the CSUSB community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we are responsible for acknowledging and making the university's relationship with Indigenous peoples visible. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indians and Indigenous peoples. And now I will turn it over to Mike German.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School and a former FBI special agent. Welcome to California State University at San Bernardino's Conversations on Race and Policing. It's my pleasure today to introduce Jessica Pishko, who's here to discuss her new book, The Highest Law in the Land: How Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Jessica is a journalist and a lawyer who graduated from Harvard Law School and Columbia University. She's been awarded journalism fellowships from the Pulitzer Center and Type Investigations, and was a 2023 New America Fellow. After turning her attention to sheriffs in 2016, she served as a fellow at the Sheriff Accountability Project at the University of South Carolina Law School. And her work is some of the first to put many of the issues related to sheriffs on the political map, and specifically for conversations about race and policing, it's very important that we cover sheriffs across the country. So first of all, Jessica, congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Why did you feel it was important to study sheriffs, and particularly this group of sheriffs that call themselves constitutional sheriffs?
I began looking at sheriffs from the viewpoint of the criminal legal system. So I had been interested in elected prosecutors and elected sheriffs because as a lawyer, I was really interested in how these elected officials were essentially politicians, but they were both really important decision makers for many issues in the criminal legal system. So for sheriffs, things like use of jails, which in California, as you guys all probably know, jails became really important after California passed realignment. Many of the jails in California suddenly became much larger, and sheriffs were the recipients of both funding for that and also making decisions on how to manage that. Around 2020, as many people remember, COVID-19 pandemic started, and I noticed a big resurgence in what many people call the constitutional sheriff movement. And so that was what got me thinking that it was at that point really important to work on a book. One of the things that I felt like had not been addressed that I was really interested in was thinking about how this constitutional sheriff movement, which we can get into a little bit, and the role of sheriffs in day-to-day criminal legal system decisions, how they were linked, and how could people think about the role overall? In particular, why was this particular politician, policing agent so prone to right-wing radicalization?
And the term constitutional sheriff is a little bit of a misnomer because sheriffs aren't mentioned in the U.S. Constitution at all.
No, they aren't. So,
But tell us about the unique history of sheriffs in our policing ecosystem in the United States.
sure. And for constitutional sheriffs, I sometimes put in quotes, sometimes I call them far right sheriffs because the Constitution is what they call themselves, right? To make what they're doing sound more politically neutral. So, what is interesting about sheriffs, I think, a lot of people started to talk, particularly in 2020, around the summer of 2020, to talk about the role of police and the background of police and their jobs as slave catchers and where that came from. Sheriffs have a slightly different background, and I was particularly interested in this because it's something sheriffs talk about a lot, and it's really important to a lot of sheriff movements. Sheriffs came from, in essence, England, where they were called the Shire Reeve. So the reeves were like counties, and they were the head of the county, right? In that time, it's a very old position. It's mentioned in the Magna Carta, which is something a lot of constitutional sheriffs will bring up. And this is like the sheriff of Nottingham. So the sheriff basically was in charge of mostly collecting taxes and making sure people followed the king's laws. The job got imported to the United States, and it's a little unclear exactly how and when states adopted it. It's actually rather inconsistent across states. So some colonies had them, some didn't. Virginia had them quite a bit, but largely in terms of managing counties that were largely these are basically corporations, right? Like a lot of the colonies were really serving as outposts for corporations and doing that kind of basically importing and exporting supplies. And so what we do know is around the 1830s when Andrew Jackson was president. So Andrew Jackson, he was a soldier, a farmer, a big fan of what a lot of people call Jacksonian democracy. Also, right, was very much into wars. He waged many wars against indigenous people, was responsible for the removal of indigenous people from their lands. And one of the ideas he had was that people, especially white, what we would call now like the white working class, was basically white yeoman farmers, should be able to elect their local officials. And one of those local officials he thought people should elect were sheriffs. So across the country, as Anglo-Saxon settlers moved westward, so this was also a time when, indigenous people were both being removed from their land, and the United States was either purchasing or claiming through war more territory to the west, the idea of an elected sheriff spread. And a lot of states started writing state constitutions. And as they wrote state constitutions, they all wrote in elected officials, including elected sheriffs. And that's where we got the idea of sheriffs as both kind of an elected official. Now, in that time, of course, law enforcement was very different from what it was today, right? Just that we didn't have very organized law enforcement. Courts were very poorly organized, if there were courts at all. And so one of the ways in which sheriffs did a form of policing was basically kind of like organized militias. A lot of sheriffs and a lot of men Anglo-Saxon men in particular, who moved west towards California, were decommissioned soldiers. So they had fought in wars. A lot of them had fought in the Spanish-American War. And so they tended to join up with sheriffs and became kind of like a small militia. And in California, they were called vigilance committees. So basically, they would get together in the saloon, decide who was the troublemaker, right? So maybe there was someone they thought was a horse thief, something like that. And then they would, with the sheriff, could go out, hunt down whoever the alleged horse thief was. So that was basically policing, right? It was kind of quasi-military. It was a quasi-vigilante. They didn't really have like codes or policing codes, but there also were not really other police around. And that's how sheriffs also ended up running jails. So jails were places where sheriffs basically were paid to hold people. So they would hold someone, and then when that person was collected, so if it was like an enslaved person or someone they thought would be an enslaved person, if the enslaver came, they would pay the fee, and they would take the person home with them. Or it would be the rule that if no one came after a certain period of time, the sheriff himself could sell that individual at auction and keep the proceeds. So it was always kind of like a military style, but also very much like a per fee kind of activity. So things were just done. There was no salary for sheriffs, right? They just did jobs for a fee.
And you discuss in the book basically the sheriff's enforcement of white supremacy, enforcement of black codes in the South and across the country. Talk about the influence of white supremacy on how the sheriffs see their role, and particularly I thought it was interesting the discussion around convict leasing.
Right. So the story of sheriffs doesn't quite stop there, but the early roots you can already see, right, are very much rooted in white supremacy, but also kind of the myth of America, which is something I thought was really interesting, right? Like the idea that westward expansion of the United States was inevitable and good was kind of taken for a given by a lot of people, and also sheriffs. And they were there in essence to protect Anglo-Saxon settlers from other people who were there, right? So indigenous people or people who were Mexican, who were already living on the land, etc. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, so Reconstruction was a time actually in which people, especially Black men who could now vote, were trying to actually elect their own sheriffs in places where they had a majority. But after Reconstruction, a lot of states reinstated what were called Black codes, and they were basically laws that just applied to free Black people. So they were what we would now call loitering laws, or if you were standing around during work hours, you could get arrested and asked what you were doing. To travel from place to place, many Black men had to have a letter that said, gave permission, permission to travel or permission to go to a different city. And sheriffs were largely responsible for enforcing them. And because sheriffs ran jails, and this was now when jails became more important, right? They would arrest people, and in lieu of paying to house them themselves, they rented them out. And they rented them out to farms, to mines, to basically factories, what would then be considered factories, and places like the Everglades to get tar, which I always point out because that was one of the most dreaded jobs. Apparently, they would have to work and live in the Everglades and tap the trees for tar, and it was really terrible. And again, as one might see, that the practice called convict leasing was really awful. I mean, it was basically indeterminate sentence. Nobody told you when you were going home. People didn't have shoes. They didn't have food. Children, especially male children as young as 10 or 11, were sent to work. So, many people call it, in the famous book, it's slavery by another name, right? It was kind of another way to basically exert white supremacy. And sheriffs were really important in this job, in particular in places in the South where sheriffs were mostly white. Sheriffs remained mostly white for a pretty long time, even in places where there was a majority Black population. And a lot of their job was indeed to enforce these codes and then sort of provide labor to a lot of local business people who relied on convict leasing to basically get their work done. Now, convict leasing kind of eventually came to an end, but even then there were still many other issues involving basically racial subjugation. So, for example, because sheriffs operated jails, they were responsible, according to many southern states, to prevent lynching. So when someone would get arrested, sometimes a lynch mob would come to the jail and want to basically execute that person on the spot. Southern states decided to put basically the job to the sheriff to prevent lynchings. And this was largely, I found out, not because Southern states were being like kind and generous, but because Southern states didn't want the liability, is what happened. So their idea was like, well, if the county sheriff's responsible and something bad happens, we can just like sue the sheriff or remove the sheriff, and it's not our problem because we're like, well, it wasn't our job to do it. And that is kind of the root of a lot of abuses by sheriffs and their deputies. So sometimes to prevent, extrajudicial lynchings, when sheriffs would arrest people, they would beat them up, and then they would take them somewhere, beat them up, and then bring them through the town into the jail so that the, potential lynch mob waiting would see like, oh, don't worry about it. We already roughed this person up. Like, you don't have to worry about it. Like, I took care of business. And that was right away another way of kind of always ensuring that, the people in the county, the white people in the county, felt like the sheriff was ensuring their interests, right? And again, as I point out, because sheriffs were elected, and before the civil rights movement, there were not a lot of Black people voting. So a lot of the people voting were white people, and the sheriff wanted to make sure that those constituents, right, felt like the sheriff was like keeping their interest in mind.
And that's a good point, past the civil rights movement to where this new concept of sheriffs being the highest authority in the land came about, and where it came from.
Right. So, sheriffs have, I think, always felt like they had a lot of power. I often point out that during Reconstruction and during the civil rights movement, Black community members always tried to elect Black sheriffs. This was like a demand that people wanted, right? And they worked really hard to. And it was always met with a lot of resistance. I mean, that's just sort of the end run of it, was that, white people in the community did not want Black sheriffs for a few reasons. One of them was because sheriffs as law enforcement had guns. And so there was like a huge distrust of giving Black people guns in general. But also there was this sort of anxiety because the sheriff was the person who kept the local order. So Eric Foner, the great historian of Reconstruction, sort of traced that a lot of white people living in the South said that, they were okay with having Black men in either the legislature, the state house, but they really didn't want sheriffs to be Black men because they worried, well, that's the person I have to interact with every day. And I don't want, I'm really worried that this will happen. There were also intense worries by white people that if they elected Black sheriffs, that they would sort of enact vengeance upon like white community members, sort of a flip side of like sheriffs working with the Klan to terrorize Black communities. And so, kind of as that progressed on, and I want to point out that sheriffs today remain really white. Like there's 90% white men. There are very, very few Black sheriffs. I think maybe 2 or 3% right now. And it was only in the last decade or two that some counties elected their first Black sheriff since Reconstruction. So this is still, right, it kind of created this precedent that remains to today. And, it's over time, as the country changed, policing changed a lot. I think it's fair to point out, right? In the 60s and 70s, policing became really professionalized. They got better weapons. We got a lot of city police. They started wearing uniforms and following codes. And sheriffs kind of saw themselves in opposition to that, which is kind of where they got this idea that they were the highest law in the land. The changes in policing were seen by some sheriffs as both a threat and an opportunity. They worried, and some community members, some people worried that this professionalization of police would kind of exclude the county sheriff, or that the county sheriff was still, kind of the democratic will of the people. So like, while, the NYPD might wear a uniform and enforce codes, the sheriff would still be kind of the community representative, and he was answerable to a higher law. He wasn't there just to give people traffic tickets. He was there to like ensure people's constitutional rights, which is where this constitutional sheriff movement came from. Over time, as the country started to change, what happened was some groups, particularly people who very much opposed the desegregation of schools. So this was rhetoric that was started in history. They call it, it was this, my mind just blanked out on what it was called, the Southern strategy, right? This idea that the southern states and southern local governments could just not desegregate their schools. They were like, oh, I don't have to do what the Supreme Court told me to do. I'm just not going to do it. What's going to happen? I mean, what did happen was that the federal government sent the National Guard, right? That's what happened. They had to send an army down to enforce desegregation. And sheriffs were a part of that, right? They were like, well, I'm not going to, I'm not going to force schools to desegregate, because I do what the people, I do what the community wants, and that's not what people want. And so there was always this idea floating around that like sheriffs were the law enforcement that were in the best position to, in essence, resist state or federal authority. And I think, as a lot of people know, during the 70s and 80s, there was kind of a rise of far-right groups, particularly in the Midwest and West. A lot of these groups centered around things, both desegregation, changes in policing, resistance to student protesters, many themes that sound kind of familiar today, right? There was a lot of students protesting the Vietnam War. Some people felt upset about that, like a sense that things were changing. At the same time, in the Midwest, there was a farm crisis, a genuine farm crisis, in which a lot of people lost their land. So banks foreclosed on farmers' land, they lost family farms, and this was also seen as kind of a problem with outsiders. So a lot of these people became radicalized to the far right, who kind of promised them that, the problems were caused by Jewish bankers who were foreclosing on their farms, or immigrants who were purchasing these farms, or, radical socialists and communists who were like radicalizing their children in the schools. And all these groups looked to the county sheriff as the only legitimate law enforcement. A movement called Posse Comitatus basically was a place where they called it, white Christian men could join together, and they wore little stars and said they were like the sheriff's posse. And then they were very violent. So one of the things I do want to be fair and point out is like Posse Comitatus was a really violent movement. They engaged in a lot of shootouts. Sheriffs did not like them in particular because they were so violent. So they were seen as like a threat to law enforcement. And kind of, they didn't have this necessarily prominent at the time, but like domestic terrorism threat. And I think most people might know about some of the incidents in the 90s that radicalized the far right. So in 1992, there was a standoff at Ruby Ridge between a white separatist and the U.S. Marshals, in which the U.S. Marshals killed a wife, a baby, and another individual. So there was, this created a lot of sense that like the federal government was coming after some of these sort of rural separatists, survivalists, and white supremacists. They were kind of all wrapped up together. And Waco in 1993 furthered this. So another kind of federal government intervention that went very poorly. And then in 1995, of course, Timothy McVeigh bombed an Oklahoma federal building, and he was inspired by a lot of these movements. And kind of all three of these sort of radicalized the far right, but also brought in like the idea of constitutional sheriffs with them. So one of the major figures in the constitutional sheriff movement was an ex-Arizona sheriff named Richard Mack, and he was involved tangentially in all these incidents. I usually say he's kind of like Forrest Gump, like he would sort of pop up, like he would just pop up at all these incidents, along with lots of other like various far right people like Bo Gritz and some of these other guys who were kind of bouncing around on the far right. And that's where the idea of like bringing sheriffs together in a sort of formal movement would, in essence, become a way kind of to create like a more formalized militia movement. I would say is how it was originally seen. Like the militia movement worried a lot of people because they were extra legal militias, and you know, after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a lot of interest in terms of federal government looking at militia groups. There was a lot of concern about what militia groups were doing and was it dangerous. And so, you know, Richard Mack and his constitutional sheriff followers had this idea that if they focused on the sheriff, that would be like less scary. It would kind of legitimize the movement, right? Because these would be real, you know, they will always emphasize these are like actual county sheriffs in office. So they are permitted to have firearms. They're permitted to use their discretion to enforce the law. And so there's sort of like nothing illegal about what they're doing per se.
And in highlighting the risk of that, one of the authorities the sheriffs claim is this authority to organize posses.
Right. So the idea, you know, the posse idea is very old. So as I was talking about the vigilance committees, right, that was just a posse. And I always had this idea that like the sheriff could call up a posse to go, you know, whatever the sheriff needed done. And as I said, there weren't really like standing police forces at the time. So the posse was, yeah, kind of made sense as a concept. And a lot of sheriff's departments still have them. I mean, most of them do. Some of them have a sort of like a posse that's kind of like a ceremonial posse, like they appear at parades and they ride on horses. And some sheriffs, you know, infamously Joe Arpaio had like really large posses that were entitled to do actual policing. So they had badges and, you know, could arrest people. And some of them thought they could investigate crimes, which they're not really supposed to, but his posse was so large, he had to hire staff to track the posse because the posse was like so he had like 2,000, Arpaio had like 2,000 people in his posse. And so it took a lot of like actual staff to make sure the posse wasn't like running afoul of the law, which I always think is a little interesting because usually the posse is brought up as kind of like a cost saving move. Like, oh, you get volunteer deputies and they're going to, you know, they'll direct traffic, a lot of, like we work at football games or something like that. Like, and they work usually for free.
And you mentioned how the sheriffs, or this constitutional sheriffs movement kind of legitimized some of these far right ideas as owned by elected government official. But when they use this posse authority to reach out to other militia groups that otherwise had been looked at as illegitimate, you know, talk about the associations between those groups where you have law enforcement officers kind of intermingling with people like the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So I think that the thing about the posse is like, because, well, most states don't require a background check to join the sheriff's posse, and the sheriff gets to pick who's in his posse. And so what generally happens is sheriffs pick their friends or friends of their friends. And in a lot of cases, particularly like a lot of rural places or a lot of places where you have active militias, those same people are militia members. And so there's always been this kind of like cross-pollination because they're attracted to the job of kind of pretending to be law enforcement, and they have guns and they like sheriffs. So it's sort of like this mutual nexus. Now, one of the things that did start happening more recently was a lot of departments and states had disbanded their posses because of Joe Arpaio's posse, to be honest. Like he gave posses kind of a bad name and a lot of places disbanded them. What happened around 2020 was actually sheriffs started restarting their posse. Most of them said it was in response to Black Lives Matters protesters that they were forming posses to basically defend the county from Black Lives Matters protesters was the most common thing I saw. And this is where you got a huge mixing with militia members, right? Because they were starting up these posses. Again, many of these places, that's who's there. Like those are the sheriff's constituents, buddies at the shooting club, or, like the stuff they do in their spare time, friends from church. And again, because sheriffs are kind of elected, they're very tapped into like the power structure. Most of them are white men, so they're tapped into this power structure that is kind of like de facto in these circles. I mean, one of the things I definitely found is that a lot of militia or militia style groups always go to the sheriff. Like they'll say to the sheriff, like, hey, we're going to come out. We heard there's a Black Lives Matter protest. We're going to come out. And what is certainly true is that sheriffs, whether they are pro militia or not, they tend to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, is what I would say. So like in some instances, they ask to be on like police radio, and the sheriffs are like, well, no, I can't do that. They're like, well, I can't have you on the police radio, but you can come out, or like, I welcome my supporters to come out. And they sort of see them as like their buddies, right? And they have a sort of positive feeling about them. Like they don't see them as threatening, right? On the opposite end, if they were talking about like Black Lives Matters protesters or student protesters, sheriffs tend to see those groups as like adversarial. So when they believe there's a Black Lives Matters protest, right, the attitude of sheriffs as law enforcement is like, this is a threat, and they'll kind of go into like threat, right, neutralizing the threat mode, whereas they just don't see militia groups or militia affiliated people, because some people might be kind of loosely militia affiliated. They don't see those people as like threats, and so they just don't go into kind of like threat neutralizing mode. They see them as like friends.
Yeah, so some of the
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
yeah, the power. Does the power come from the fact that they are elected, or does the power just come from the fact that they cover a larger area?
That's a really good question. So I will say, one, there's like a little discrepancy between the power sheriffs think they have and the power they actually have, right? And that's like one of the things I really felt, I really felt like there aren't a lot of cases about this. Like I will say as a lawyer, there's just not like case law about sheriff's power. And so I was really curious, like what's their real power? Do they actually have all these powers? I would say sheriffs believe that they have a lot of powers because they are elected and because their office is old. That's like their general like claim, right? It's like an ancient office with this gravitas, and they're elected, so they represent the people. Unelected administrators can't represent the people and can't be the highest law in the land. Now, that said, they don't have an awful lot of legal ground to stand on, just being honest, because counties elect a lot of people, right? You elect like a county commissioners, you elect like you might elect a county manager or judges or a DA. And in state constitutions and laws, like there's no like special sheriff. There was no state with like a special sheriff provision. Some states, some have periodically tried to create them, but it's not like they're different from other elected officials. They just are, and elected officials have to follow laws. That's just, that's how it works. And I want to say, not all states have the sheriff in their constitution. So like a third of states don't even have sheriffs in the constitution. They're just created by statute. And in every state, there are lots and lots of statutes that apply to sheriffs. Namely like ones around their pensions and stuff like that, which they don't really object to those. I'm like, well, they can make laws around like your pension and like what money you're entitled to and like how liable you are. Those are like, okay. So like there are plenty of laws. Like every state has laws that apply to sheriffs just like everybody else. So a lot of it is honestly just kind of like chutzpah. And the fact that people don't tell them no very often for a variety of reasons. But I think that that's a lot of it. If you are a law enforcement officer and you do something and no one tells you no, well, you're kind of just going to keep doing it, right? And plus, who doesn't want to be told they're like really important? It's like that's great, a great gig.
And so one of the things that I found as a political action person is locally, this is what happens in our San Bernardino County. The sheriff is the sheriff. before he leaves office, or he always leaves office prior to his assignment, and he assigns an undersheriff as the new sheriff while
Mhm.
as he vacates his position, and that individual is always put back in position because of he's did it 6 months. He's doing a good job, and let's leave him where he is. Nothing's broken. Keep it going. That also eliminates African Americans, Hispanics, and minorities to be the sheriff because they got this program going on over and over and over again. And it's not just San Bernardino County. I assume it's a lot of counties that the sheriffs do that to keep the family or the friendship going. Did you
Yes.
look into that?
I mean, that's absolutely correct. So the other thing about sheriffs is they can I mean, they basically kind of juke the system, right? So people can elect sheriffs, sure, but one, as you rightly point out, like I sometimes joke it's like an inherited position because there's also a lot of places where like someone's dad was the sheriff and then the son is the sheriff or their brother, right? Like there's a lot of places where this, especially like smaller counties, less populous counties, this is really common. And not in a lot of places. So two things. One is that usually, and not in California because you have deputy unions, but in a lot of other places, sheriffs can hire and fire at will. So sheriffs often hire their friends or family members, like their cousins and their sons, right? So that also, as you point out, like keeps the people in the office white because the sheriff is white, so he hires his friends and his family members. They're usually also white, and then he can elevate who he wants. So the sheriff decides like who's the undersheriff. The sheriff picks who he thinks is a good undersheriff. So that continues the process. And then, if someone in the office runs against the sheriff, so let's say they don't like the sheriff, and they're like, I don't like the sheriff, I'm going to run against him because I think he's bad, or I think he's, for various reasons. The sheriff can both sometimes can fire that person just because they want to. So there's a lot of places where they just fire the person running, which is bad because you lose your job, which a lot of people running for sheriff are not independently wealthy. So that makes it hard, like it makes it hard to run for sheriff. Like, I know people who ran for sheriff, got fired, and then had to go like work another job while they ran for sheriff because they got fired. And the sheriff also has the ability to do things like release information. So just recently, a sheriff in Michigan, someone in his office ran against him who's a woman. He released a bunch of like bad, like a sort of unsubstantiated investigation against her, like just saying like, oh, by the way, here's this like info on my opponent, maybe you want to know, right? So they could do that too, right? They can like leak info. Sometimes they email their like the deputies in the office, like, don't support my opponent or else you're going to get in trouble. So like, yeah, the sheriff has a lot of ways to kind of like control the election system because they have a lot of control over their office and the people that work there.
And why hasn't it changed over the years? Why, from the beginning of your history to today, the posses, LA's last sheriff is now under investigation for having put together a group of police officers
Mm-hmm.
to investigate anyone that was in his way, anyone that stood against him, and they're trying to actually get him for that. Why hasn't it changed over the years?
Well, that's certainly like the question of the book. I mean, people might have different answers. Look, my answer might be like a little controversial. When I got to the end of writing the book, my answer was like, well, because that's what the office is. Like basically the office is set up so that people in power can stay in power, and it keeps people who out of right, it keeps the people they don't want in power out of power. And that's what I agree with you. That's what we see over and over is that sheriffs have a lot of ways to keep themselves and people like them in power. And it's very hard to stop that. And so, I mean, that's why, in the conclusion of the book, I pretty much say that I don't think there should be sheriffs, because it's hard to see. Well, I think one is there's not been like a real reckoning of the harms sheriffs have caused. Like, I think owning up to convict leasing has not been something I've seen any sheriff do. Jails are still very dangerous. They hold a lot of people who haven't yet been convicted of a crime. We know that, mass incarceration disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. So like we already, right, the system is also kind of rigged in that way. And so I think that was what the office was intended to do. I mean, if you look at how it was formed and why it was elected, that is why it became that way.
And one of the things that a lot of the problems you're talking about are writ large for this office, the office of the sheriff. But they're this subset of, as you said, far right sheriffs, and the particular threat that they pose because of the rhetoric they're using. And this somewhat picks up on a question in the Q&A about the rhetoric around keeping the peace. But what exactly are they talking about when these far right sheriffs are keeping the peace, particularly down in the border areas, which you have an entire chapter devoted to?
Right. I mean, look, the thing about the keeping the peace and the highest law in the land, like a lot of it is, it's sort of like a strong man persona, right? It's the idea, and even if you look at like fictional sheriffs, let's say, even fictional good sheriffs, right? They don't like totally follow all the law, like they don't want to do the paperwork. They're like, oh, rules and paperwork are like really annoying. I don't want to do it. But in the end, they get justice, right? That's kind of the idea of the sheriff, right? It's gonna come out right with the good judgment of good men. And like I said, there's always like complaining about paperwork and administration gets in the way. And even if it's for the good, or what most people might think good. And I think that that's where they get this idea that like keeping the peace, like because they are elected and they sort of have a more like populist image, and they are more populist because they are elected. They're not like professional police chiefs. They're tasked with, keeping the peace, protecting their constituents, and they can do so in a kind of way that sort of like scorns, oh, keeping my receipts, or I don't want to have, I don't want to have to write stuff down or whatever. And, because sheriffs do get to control, I think people don't realize that sheriffs in many places get to control the back office that way. So like they get to decide like what's their record keeping system, if they have one. Like an awful lot, terribly too many sheriffs like don't know who's in their jail. This is like a consistent problem. Like you're like, who's in your jail? And they're kind of like, oh, or they have like a card thing, like it's not on a computer, it's like card, it's like a written down. There's one sheriff office who had like a red book. And they're like, I don't know, whatever's in the red book, but this is like what somebody wrote down. So like they don't always like do that, but also because they kind of, I think there's like a little bit of disdain for sort of like bureaucratic stuff. And the office has always been that way. But I think that's what lends itself to like an attraction to the far right, right? And sheriffs also skew really conservative, like they just skew like much more conservative on many issues than even the people in their community. And so they kind of lean that way. And so then when someone comes in and is like, oh, by the way, you can do whatever you want, and that's like a good thing, they're like, oh yeah, that is a good thing. I will say that Alex Villanueva was greatly admired by constitutional sheriffs. He was not, as far as I could tell, officially with them, but his like tactics, especially these like tactics of like, yeah, attacking his enemies, his kind of like, strong man persona, say what I want, whatever. Like that was like really appealing to constitutional sheriffs. And they definitely held him up as kind of like an example of like a good sheriff.
And he ran
as hard as that is to believe.
he ran as a liberal also. I couldn't understand how, in comparison to someone else, I suppose he was a liberal. But under his watch and under Baca's, there was, and there still is, are deputy gangs
Right.
that we've had people come on this space and talk about, and almost the impossibility of getting rid of these gangs. And this goes back 30 or 40 years in the LA Sheriff's Department. I'm wondering if you think that there is a connection between the status of elected sheriff and its inability, because I don't think LAPD has the same has the same problem as the LA sheriff, and it could be perhaps because we've got a couple of other counties, Riverside and San Bernardino, that also have problems in terms of their law enforcement, their deputies. So what do you think? Do you have any thoughts on that, Jessica? Sorry for the long question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I don't want to say that because I kind of don't want to create too much of a like police v sheriff, like police are good and sheriffs are bad, because I don't I don't think that's really true. Like, no, I just want to say like I don't like to create too much. I do think like the sheriffs tend to foster that for a few different reasons, right? So like when you look at Chad Bianco or Alex Villanueva, like they do tend to like hire and promote the people they like, right? And then the way the gangs formed was like that's how they decided like who's signed on to the agenda and who's not signed on to the agenda, right? So they kind of weed out the folks that don't want to buy into whatever whatever the policy is. They don't want to do what the guys in charge are doing. They leave probably sensibly. And then the ones that do, right, that buy onto the program, well, they're going to kind of do what the people above them tell them to do. And that's how they get sort of initiated these gangs. I mean, I think LA is a particular challenge because of its geography. Like, because LA is like very large, you have a lot of these substations that really do operate kind of literally like the Wild West. Like those deputies are out there doing like whatever. As far as like, it's like, the deputies out in these substations, San Bernardino has those too. Riverside has them, where these deputies are out in these substations kind of like doing what they want, like sort of like little fraternities. And I think they both feel like they get to decide what they want to do, but also like they aren't getting like the physical oversight. I mean, as you guys all know, like in LA, it's like a long drive. It's like literally hard to get to. Like Antelope Valley is far away. And so if you have a deputy substation in Antelope Valley, I think they do feel like, well, we decide how we run. I mean, and that's where I think you get to the root of the issue, right? Is like they're not representing the people in Antelope Valley, right? They're doing what the LA Sheriff's Department is telling them to do, right? So they're sort of imposing like what they think is good policing on the people that live there. And so that's where I think it starts to feel like, right, like an occupying force, because they're not representing that section. But so I also think like in many ways, LA particularly lends itself to that because it is so like, it's very diverse, very geographically spread out.
Yeah, on our ballot this coming up, we have a proposition that says no forced labor of inmates. And one of the transitions that's taking place is, so instead of them sending groups out to the community to do labor or into the mines or into the fields, what's happened is they've literally locked them down and created powerful gangs in prison. Mm-hmm. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Oh, you mean the people incarcerated in the jail?
The jail, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because sheriffs exert a lot of power over their jails. I don't think people think about. So everything from like how they're housed, which gets to like, I mean, California prisons do this too, or they did it. I don't know if they still do it, but they do this thing where they house people, right? They house people by race. And so they sort of house people together in certain ways that they think is going to be like most conducive to order in their minds, right? So they decide how the folks are housed, what floors, in LA, what floor you're on, but they also decide like how they're going to use solitary, who your cellmate in jail is going to be, and how much time outside you get, and like how visits are going to go. So because the sheriff gets to control all that, they sort of set like the rules of the game. I mean, that said, I will say in a lot of places, this idea of using incarcerated people for labor is really common. Like in some, like Louisiana, they regularly use people in the jail to do work, like work on roads. I mean, they basically sort of like lease them to the county to do like county work, like picking up. Some of them were doing like roofing, work cleaning up after Hurricane Katrina, really dangerous work too. And like, just to say, like, one, they don't get paid or they don't get paid very much. And two, they don't get benefits, or like, if you're hurt on the job, they don't get to benefit from like workers' comp or insurance, right? So they're not protected in the same way workers are who aren't in jail. And even in some places, it's unfortunately not uncommon to use people in the jail as like setting up for your like re-election barbecue. There's a lot of re-election barbecues that go or like hand out flyers or put out signs. So like political activity, sending them to fix like their friends' houses. So I mean, it's a little wild that sheriffs feel like they can just kind of use people that I mean, a lot of times they put them in the jail and then they decide how they or stay there, and then they get to decide like, oh, here's where you're going to go and what we're going to do. And this is not true in California. Well, it is sometimes true in California, not necessarily in LA, but in a lot of places, sheriffs also get to decide kind of who goes home, like who gets to well, we're out of room in the jail, so we're going to like send some of these people home. And some places, in some especially rural places, right, if you show up at the jail, let's say you were drunk driving, you're supposed to serve time in the jail, the sheriff will just be like, just like, go, whatever, go home. Like they just tell people to go home, or, like it's sort of like they can like shut the door. I mean, which came up a lot in COVID because I was trying to work with some people to let people out of the jail, right? In COVID, and sheriffs are like, oh, I decide everything. I'm the highest law in the land. And then when advocates called and we're like, hey, can you let like a lot of people out because of COVID? They're all like, oh no, I can't do that. We're very sorry. It's so it tends to be the highest level, except when you ask them to do something that's like basically like something progressives want, they're suddenly like, oh, I can't. Oh, well, I have to do that. It's like, I can't, let people out.
And that's a good time to ask a question that's also in the chat about who has responsibility for policing the sheriffs. And typically we think of the FBI and Department of Justice involved in that activity, but also you talk a bit about kind of self-regulation, the National Sheriffs Association, how effective they are in curbing some of the worst tendencies, particularly among the groups that adopt these far-right ideologies.
Yeah, so the FBI, and I will say the FBI and Department of Justice do get involved when they think there's a crime being committed. So the limits I think that the FBI and DOJ have is that one is that there's only like one of them and there's like 3,000 sheriffs, and two, that they tend to wait until there's like what they see as like an actionable crime. So, I was thinking the New York Times reported on these Mississippi deputies who were abusing people both in their custody and people in the community, right? And the FBI is now involved because they've committed crimes, right? So that's usually what happens. Now, the problem is, in my view, the problem tends to be that mere like sympathy with or affiliation with groups like the Oath Keepers or the constitutional sheriffs is not a crime, right? Like you can say like, I like Oath Keepers, it's not a crime. Now, I argue at a minimum, they shouldn't be getting government money. So Chad Bianco is an example. The sheriff of Riverside has said he was a member of the Oath Keepers. He got like $1 million from the federal government to, I don't know, hire new deputies or something. I personally posited that if someone says they're a member of the Oath Keepers, they shouldn't like benefit from government money. But that's not like, that's not a real rule. And so I just kind of I was like, well, that's a rule you could do right now. You could make that rule right now. And so that's through the problem. And the other issues like the National Sheriff's Association, which is like a nonprofit, kind of like lobbying org, right? Maybe they set best practices. they've kind of just had a hands-off attitude. Like, I've talked to National Sheriff's Association about constitutional sheriffs many times, and their attitude about it is like, well, people can say whatever they want. Like, they can say what they want if they, right? It's free speech. They're political. They're running for office. If they want to say this or that, like, it's fine. And I mean, they have a point, to be fair. Like, in this political environment, a lot of stuff is kind of like accepted rhetoric by, one political party. And so are they saying anything that different? It's a fair point. I do think, some states are trying to do it. So Washington State is experimenting. I just saw this other one about the sworn law enforcement officers. Washington State's experimenting with basically laws that prohibit belonging to like extremist groups, and they want to apply it to sheriffs. And what it would entail is basically like a background check on people running for sheriff. Now, sheriffs are opposing this mightily. They are insisting that like background checks are not fair, like, this, and they're talking like check their references. Have they been accused of misconduct? Were they dismissed from another department for misconduct? That kind of stuff. And the sheriffs don't like it, so they're like busy opposing it. They do have it for deputies, so they background check deputies, and if deputies are found to be members of like Patriot Front or something, they can get their like law enforcement license revoked. But because sheriffs are elected, that's presented like a huge problem in terms of like the sort of the limit of free speech versus right, like free speech versus like what's not. This has been the same issue with like the deputy gangs, right? Like the defense of deputy gangs is like it's free speech, and if they want to get matching tattoos or whatever, that's like they can do it if they want. You can't, right? That's what Villanueva's always said is like, well, I can't like check everyone's tattoo. That's not fair. I mean, we do it with street gangs. Just I mean, we do have rules that like if we have street gangs, like there are rules, there are many laws about that, but it doesn't seems like you could split that difference. But that's like been the historical problem. I do think, like that said, that the constitutional sheriffs movement, well, it's small. Like, I want to be fair, it's not like a lot of sheriffs. It's maybe like 300 sheriffs out of 3,000 who are really core members, but the ideology is really widespread. So even the National Sheriff's Association, like last time they had a conference, they had this like far right pastor speak who argues in favor of what's called the law of lesser magistrates, which is like a version of constitutional sheriff theory. So they had this guy give a prayer. And when I pressed them on it, like, why did you have this person? Like, this person is like a known extremist figure. Why was he there? Why did he give this? It was like an hour-long sermon. They said, well, they have a point because sheriffs don't have to enforce every rule. Like, some of those rules are just orders, and they don't have to enforce all the orders. And I think we've seen, especially with respect to like gun laws, that sheriffs have pretty eagerly like joined on saying like they don't have to enforce like gun regulations. And sometimes they'll be like, oh, it's a regulation, it's not a law, or, so it's kind of spreading in this way that's like giving sheriffs this impression that like, oh, if there's this rule that's like, let's say, I think New Mexico, the governor of New Mexico imposed a rule that basically shut down open carry in Albuquerque for like a month because they had a lot of shootings. And all the sheriffs were like, no, we don't have to do that. That's not like a law. That's just an order. And so I feel like it's kind of spreading. Now, I also think it's spreading like in general, like, like in many places, right? We see attorneys general kind of being like, I don't like that law and I'm not going to do it. So I think it's also like a widespread thing.
Why are
And
go ahead,
go
Mike.
ahead, Stan.
I was going to say,
I was going to say,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
because we have an election looming, and there a lot of concerns have been about things that sheriffs have said, claiming authority to do election monitoring or
Right.
otherwise, even to select posses to do that for them. Tell us about your concerns there. If
It's bad. My summary is it's bad. I mean, sheriffs are not supposed to be involved in elections. Like law enforcement just aren't supposed to. They were in, you know, the 60s, and then they passed laws saying you can't because they're intimidating. And they used to have voting in like the sheriff's office, like you would go to the sheriff's office to vote and register. People stopped doing that because it was intimidating, and because the sheriff would just be like, oh, I'm not going to register you right now. Or they ask questions and the sheriff's like, you didn't answer the questions right, we're not going to register you. So I mean, there's a history of that, right? And I think, you know, what I get really concerned about is not just that sheriffs can interfere in ways like posses, they can make political, right? We know they can make political comments, they could say whatever they want or put it on Facebook, they can form these posses, but they also can actually arrest people, right? Like if sheriffs, there are actual police. And so no matter what they say or how many posses they have or how, you know, whatever, how harmful or hateful what they write is, they can still like go and arrest people. And if sheriffs have, and they have, right, if they want to target, especially if they want to racially profile, let's say Latino voters, because of these like new anxieties about non-citizen voters, if they want to kind of target Latino voters to look for people who might have committed crimes, they can do that, right? Like, and it has happened, right? In Arizona, people affiliated with True the Vote did send their video to the sheriff, and the sheriff went and arrested for Latino women, alleging that they had been doing what people call ballot harvesting, which is just, I mean, basically is like if you touch someone else's ballot is what was going on. And a lot of community groups, like a lot of people rely on community groups to vote, right? This is very common. You have people that assist you either in the ballot or assist you in the voting process, especially if maybe you don't speak English or something like that. So like, this is a very common practice that communities have done. And so I worry a lot, just, you know, there's the general air of violence, but also like people, like the very real possibility of people getting arrested, which will frighten people and make people not want to vote, right? If they're worried about that.
They have a simple thing going on now with the election too, is your signature. So if you
Right.
registered to vote 10 years ago, and today they're going to compare your signature to the signature that you put on your registered to vote thing 10 years ago. If it's changed, they have the opportunity to challenge that, to
Right.
whether that's you or not. But I can't wait to get your book, because the question I had prior to was, what was the big fear of Black Lives Matter and student protests? I mean, it was out of control. These officers, these law enforcement agencies, really beefed up their numbers behind those two things.
Well, I can say in the, like I said in the book, I talk, the Black Lives Matters protests in 2020 were extremely radicalizing for sheriffs. Like, not only did a lot of them feel, I think, personally attacked, like they felt like, oh, the call is like, we're right, like defund the police, or like, I mean, really the call is like, be less violent. What tends to happen is that every time there's a sort of liberal or progressive ask, right? Like we ask that you stop using chokeholds. We ask that you not cooperate with ICE to protect immigrant communities, you know, all these things that people are asking law enforcement to do. Sheriffs in particular, because they are rather conservative and because they have more flexibility than like a police chief can't just form like a posse, right? Because they have more flexibility, they do tend to like react really strongly. Like they will react like 5 times what the concern is, right? And that's it. It was very radicalizing, and I do think like those protests brought out a lot of militias. It really did make sheriffs believe that they could get people to get behind their office because they created fear. I mean, that's what I think it is. It's just like fear of change, you know, fear that the office is changing, fear that policing is changing. And that's the same with the student protesters, right? And I think in particular, student protesters who are, you know, protesting against the war, the pro-Palestinian, it sort of brings up like the same fears, right? These are like people either defending or are people of color. And that's like very, I think, feels like very threatening.
Jessica, we're at our hour.
I know, we're at time.
But thank you very much. And again, congratulations on the book. It's really important work so we can understand exactly what this office, how this office threatens democracy in a way that might be different from the way we look at regular policing. So thanks very much. Thanks to Thin Lee and Pam Crossan for her support, and Jeremy Murray for doing all the organizing, putting this together. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks for the good questions.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University, San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Fall Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Thin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.